In 2007, a morphologist at the Smithsonian's Human Origins program spent several months analyzing the wrist bones of a hominin excavated from a limestone cave in Indonesia. When he published his findings, they became one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in one of the most contentious debates in modern paleoanthropology. The story ran for 2 days. His name was Matthew Tocheri. The bones had been sitting in a collection in Jakarta, not yet fully described. Not because they were hidden, because everyone was already fighting about something else. In October 2004, a team of Australian and Indonesian researchers, paleoanthropologists, archaeologists, geologists, announced something that should have stopped the world. In a cave called Liang Bua on the Indonesian island of Flores, they had found the remains of a hominin that had lived there as recently as, by the original dating at least, around 12,000 years ago. It stood roughly a meter tall. Its brain was about the size of a chimpanzee's, and it had been making stone tools. They called it Homo floresiensis. The press called it the Hobbit. The initial reaction from the scientific community was genuine astonishment. For decades, the popular story of human evolution had moved in one direction: bigger brains, bigger bodies, more complexity, eventual dominance. The idea that a separate, small-brained, tool-using human species had been living on a remote island well within the period when our own ancestors were painting caves in France, that wasn't just surprising. It broke something in the model. And when something breaks the model, alternative explanations tend to appear quickly. The most prominent counter-argument came from Teuku Jacob, one of Indonesia's most eminent paleoanthropologists. His position? The Liang Bua skull didn't belong to a new species. It belonged to a modern human, a Homo sapiens, who had suffered from microcephaly, a developmental condition that causes the brain and skull to grow abnormally small. Not a new species, an anomaly. Jacob had significant institutional authority. He also, controversially, took physical custody of the Flores bones from the excavation team, an act the Australian researchers objected to strenuously, though accounts differed over what permissions, if any, he had obtained from Indonesian colleagues and authorities. What isn't disputed is that the bones were held for months, delaying further study, and that when they were returned, some showed signs of damage. The dispute became, for a time, as much about professional conduct as about paleoanthropology. But the pathology hypothesis had genuine traction. Robert Martin, Maciej Henneberg, and others published papers supporting variants of it. Some proposed cretinism, some, later, Laron syndrome, a form of growth hormone insensitivity. The diagnoses multiplied. What united them was the conclusion: no new species, only a sick modern human, and an overreaching interpretation. The problem with all of these arguments, and this is the part that tends to get lost, is that they were grounded primarily in the skull. The skull is the most dramatic element. It photographs well. It looks like something. So the debate became a debate about cranial morphology, brain volume, and endocranial casts, conducted by researchers staring at the same remains and reaching opposite conclusions. It was a legitimate scientific dispute, but structurally, it was also a problem with no clean resolution, because the skull, on its own, couldn't decisively rule out pathology. Both sides knew it. Meanwhile, the wrist bones of Homo floresiensis were sitting in Jakarta, undescribed. Not because they were inaccessible, because the argument had already formed around what was visible, and the wrists weren't part of it yet. Tocheri changed that. If you or I were to have our wrist bones examined, you'd find a specific shape in one of the small carpal bones, the trapezoid. In modern humans, the trapezoid is boot-shaped, flat on one surface, widened at the base, oriented in a particular way relative to the surrounding bones. This is not a primitive configuration. It's derived, meaning it evolved in our lineage at some point and became fixed, a signature of a particular evolutionary history. Neanderthals have the same boot-shaped trapezoid. The derived condition appears to be characteristic of the lineage leading to modern humans and Neanderthals, traceable back several 100,000 years at minimum. The Flores wrist bones don't look like that. Working from the key carpal bones recovered from the site, the trapezoid, the scaphoid, the capitate, Tochari and his colleagues compared the morphology against an extensive reference collection of human and non-human primate wrists. The Flores trapezoid was pyramidal in shape, not boot-shaped, a configuration more closely resembling African apes and early hominins, what the technical literature calls a primitive arrangement. Primitive meaning ancestral, meaning old. Here is what that means in practice. If Homo floresiensis were a modern human with a developmental disorder, microcephaly, Laron syndrome, cretinism, any of the conditions that had been proposed, their wrist bones would still carry the shape that modern human wrists carry. Microcephaly affects the development of the brain and skull. Growth hormone disorders affect stature and body proportions. None of these conditions are known to transform the derived carpal morphology of a modern human into the primitive configuration seen in early hominins. That configuration wasn't modified by disease. It was never there to modify. It would have had to have been inherited from a lineage that diverged before the derived wrist morphology evolved in our ancestors at all. The wrist said what the skull couldn't say definitively. This was not a modern human with a developmental disorder. This was something with a genuinely different evolutionary history. Tochari published the findings in Science in September 2007. The methodology was rigorous. The comparative sample was extensive. The paper acknowledged what any honest scientific paper should, that the fossil sample was essentially one individual's carpal elements, that caution was warranted. But the morphological signal was clear. A number of researchers who had previously supported the pathology hypotheses acknowledged that the wrist evidence was difficult to reconcile with their position. Commentary in the same issue of Science described the analysis as compelling. The story ran in major newspapers for roughly 2 days. Then it disappeared. Partly that's just how the news cycle works. But something more specific was happening here. The microcephaly debate had been loud and dramatic. Institutional conflict, accusations of professional misconduct, prominent names in direct disagreement. Structurally, it was a story about people fighting. The wrist paper was a story about carpal bones and evolutionary morphology. It pointed toward resolution, and resolution is, perversely, less interesting than ongoing conflict, especially when the resolution requires explaining what a trapezoid is. So the debate wound down in the literature, but the popular understanding didn't update in step. Pathology hypotheses continued to appear in published form for several years after 2007. The scientific consensus strengthened gradually, through accumulating lines of evidence, not through any single decisive moment. But in the public imagination, the question either remained open or had been quietly resolved in favor of the skeptics. The Hobbit was probably just a sick person. That version of the story was stickier than the evidence warranted. If this kind of overlooked evidence interests you, stories where the answer existed and nobody quite registered it, we cover cases like this every week. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. What the wrist evidence pointed toward, and what subsequent work on the feet, the shoulders, the teeth, and comparative ancient DNA analysis has continued to investigate, is that Homo floresiensis likely represents a very early branch from the human family tree. The precise ancestry remains debated. Some analyses suggest derivation from an Asian Homo erectus population that underwent island dwarfism over hundreds of thousands of years. Others propose descent from an even earlier hominin, closer to Homo habilis in grade, that dispersed from Africa before many of the anatomical features we associate with later Homo had fully developed. The small-bodied fossils from Mata Menge on Flores, dating to around 700,000 years ago, suggest the lineage had deep roots on that island. Where exactly it branches is still genuinely open. What is not seriously in dispute is the island dwarfism mechanism itself. The pattern is well documented. Stegodon, a large proboscidean, a relative of elephants, underwent dramatic size reduction on Flores. Pygmy hippos are known from Cyprus, dwarf mammoths from Sardinia and Sicily. Large mammals isolated on islands with limited resources tend to shrink over generations. The pattern is not exotic. It happens reliably wherever the conditions are right. We just hadn't absorbed the implication that it could happen to a member of our own genus. And that may be the most quietly uncomfortable part of all this. Not the scientific controversy, not the institutional conflict over the bones, but what the whole picture implies about the story we've been telling ourselves. The popular narrative of human evolution has long carried an undertone of inevitability, a progression toward greater complexity, greater intelligence, eventual singularity. Flores complicates that. It suggests that under the right conditions, a human lineage can go somewhere else entirely, smaller, more isolated, physiologically archaic in ways that persist for hundreds of thousands of years. There was nothing inevitable about the direction we went. That's worth at least 2 days of attention, arguably more. The wrist bones were recovered as part of the original excavation. They sat, undescribed in the relevant comparative sense, while the argument raged around the skull for 3 years. When Tocheri and his colleagues finally did the careful morphological work, what they found was unambiguous enough that the authors used precise, measured scientific language to say so. The word that recurs in commentary on the Flores carpals is the same word that keeps surfacing in the broader story of this species: primitive. Not as a value judgment, in the technical sense, meaning genuinely, structurally old. There is something quietly unsettling about that. On an island most of us couldn't point to on a map, there were hominins making stone tools and living in the same cave system across deep time. And inside their wrists, in bones no larger than a child's marble, was the morphological signature of an evolutionary history that diverged from ours long before we became what we are. The original dating placed Homo floresiensis as recently as 12,000 years ago. Revised stratigraphy, published in 2016, pushed the skeletal evidence back to roughly 60,000 to 100,000 years ago, with associated stone tools to around 50,000 years ago. Either way, the overlap with our own species expansion was real. We were not as alone as we thought. We almost convinced ourselves otherwise. It took a trapezoid to remind us. If the evidence that gets buried beneath the louder argument is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe. That's the whole point of this channel. The cases where the answer was already there. Thanks for watching Nobody Noticed. See you next time.